Well, good afternoon. Still, I think it is, at least here, not in Washington, where Aaron David Miller is joining us from. Thank you so much. Welcome to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for what I hope will be an interesting and an important discussion about a region that has been largely ignored for the last 25 years, or in fact has been at the center of much of what it is that we're trying to do. That is the Middle East. Really pleased to have David Schenker and Mona Yacobian with us here in person. Unfortunately, Aaron David Miller is in his famous studio that we see on every network and in the NewsHour on a regular basis. So great to have you, Aaron, joining us as well. You've seen the bio, so I won't go into detail. But Mona this is new because it's hot off the press.
Breaking news. Yeah.
Breaking news is now the senior advisor and director of the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, having previously been the vice president for Middle East and North Africa at the disbanded U.S. Institute of Peace. So I'm very glad, and I think Mona, I'm sure, is very glad that she was one of the first ones to land. Unfortunately, so many others who worked hard and done amazing work at USIP are still trying to figure out where they are going to go next. But it's great to have you here. David Schenker is the top senior fellow at the Washington Institute and director of the Linda and Tony Rubin Program on Arab Politics, and he was in the Trump administration as the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs in the first Trump administration. Aaron David Miller is a senior fellow at Carnegie and has been an advisor to presidents from 1978 to 2003. Republican and Democrats, secretaries of state and presidents on Middle East politics and the Arab-Israeli peace process. So we'll start today for the discussion, then we'll open it up for Q&A. For those of you who are watching us online, you can go to ccga.live, type in your question, or if you're really shy, although you shouldn't be in this room if you're shy, then you can do that as well without having to ask the question directly. So welcome. Thanks so much for being with us. David, let's start with you. The President of the United States is today in the Gulf. His first formal, there was a Pope funeral that he had to go to for 14 hours to Italy for, but his first former trip to, again, this time to Saudi Arabia, to the Gulf. What do you think he's trying to accomplish there? Why is he going? And how is the region reacting to his trip there?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here out in Chicago with the council. Let me start by just saying there's a couple of principles. Well, you can't really say principles of the Trump administration. Let's say characteristics of the administration. They're highly transactional. They're disruptive. They're focused on deal-making, economy, and on burden sharing. The part that is being really focused on in the Gulf is the transactional element here. It's all about making deals for the United States, getting investment. They got $1 trillion. They got a huge, $142 billion in weapon sales in Saudi Arabia alone. We're going to UAE and Qatar next. We'll see what the announcements are there. Trump always had sort of a predilection, attraction to the Gulf. It's the bling thing, right? Shiny item. And because of the transactionalism, it's not what the United States can do necessarily with partners, but what these countries can do for us. And so he's going and getting all these deals, opportunities for American companies. There will be less than had been promised, but there will still be a lot. As for these states, this is a good news story for them. They're very comfortable with the Trump administration. I'm sure David will talk about this more, not only sort of the authoritarian type tendencies, perhaps, of the administration, but also the appeal that these countries have had for countries like China, the attraction. They don't lecture you on human rights. They don't lecture you on other types of value-based issues. It's purely about what China sees as interests, and this is an appealing sort of way to deal with the United States for these countries. So this is a good news story for these countries. They're high on the agenda. They understand that Trump sees the Gulf as strategic. He doesn't want military involvement there, but strategic economically for the United States.
Aaron, you work for a whole bunch of Secretary of States and presidents. Why didn't they ever go to the Middle East first, or put it in a different way? This is pretty remarkable. Donald Trump has now gone twice to Saudi Arabia on his first trip. This time he's not going to Israel, unlike the first time in 2017 when he did go to Israel. How do you see this as sort of a strategic positioning of the United States? What is the importance that he is putting on these countries in this region compared to much of the rest of the world?
Thanks, Ivo. And by the way, it's really great to be here. There are no two analysts that I know are more experienced and more able to present terrific analysis of a very complicated region. And Ivo, I would only praise you for the work you've done in government and out. I think David kind of broke the code here. I would ask the question again, why is an American president going to Saudi Arabia for a second time? Obviously, he went to the Pope's funeral, so it was not his first foreign foray. Why is this happening? What American president in the past, in the modern period, would ever go to Saudi Arabia, which, if a high degree of value affinity, a high degree of coincidence of interest, and a strong basis of domestic support are the three elements that constitute an ally: common values, high degree of coincidence of interest, and a very strong base of domestic support over time. If that's the definition of an ally, it's even hard to rationalize the trip. My read is very simple. The Gulf, and David's right, is Donald Trump's happy place. It's his happy place because he is, in fact, a transactor. He wants to end the fighting in Ukraine, but not the war. And I think that notion of quick deals, transactions, not transformations. Transformations require enormous effort, hard work, and incredible focus and discipline. Transactions, deals, whether it's capping Iran's enrichment capacity, whether it's getting hostages out and quote unquote ending the war in Gaza, or even stopping the fighting in Ukraine. That's what Donald Trump wants to do. He has authoritarian instincts. I don't think there's any doubt about that. David's right. He feels much more comfortable in the company of authoritarians than Democrats. Authoritarians don't have Congresses. They don't have media. They have no constraint. And Donald Trump, if he closed his eyes, I think would want a political system that essentially mirrors theirs. The other issue, of course, is what David referred to as the bling. I describe it as the ka-ching. It is about deals, but that's not the problem. The ka-ching isn't the problem. Cutting deals is great, particularly if they involve tremendous investment in the United States. What the problem here is the conflation of the American national interest with Trump's personal interest, with his business associates, with his sons and son-in-law. And the way the line between what is good for America and what is good for Donald Trump, it's no longer blurred. It's seamless. I'd only cite as data point A to Z the president's willingness, acquiescence to accept, he'd like to, whether it works its way through or not is unclear, a $400 million gift from the government of Qatar of an airplane to be used during Trump's presidency and after he leaves the presidency. So I would assert to you, even though we have interest in the region, and I think Donald Trump recognizes that his conception of the American national interest is tethered largely to what makes sense for his politics, his grievances, his financial interests, his vanity. And I think that makes him different, frankly, than any other president in whose administration I ever served, and certainly any Secretary of State who is doing his bidding.
Well, and I guess that sort of in both David and Aaron's answers sort of encapsulates why Saudi Arabia, I think, and the Gulf. But we'll get back to some of the issues that both of you raised. But first, I want Mona, I want to sort of your perspective on this, but also the really important thing that happened today, something that you follow closely, which is the lifting of sanctions in Syria. And the meeting that President Trump will have, the first meeting with a Syrian leader since 2000, if I got it right, which is pretty remarkable, which is supposed to happen tomorrow.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Ivo, and thanks to the Chicago Council for the invitation. Lovely to be here, and such a momentous time to be talking about the Middle East. Let me just first start by saying that not to be boring, but I agree with pretty much everything that both David and Aaron have said in terms of how they've characterized the administration's approach to the Gulf, where the appeal is, et cetera. But before answering your question, I do want to also frame this a little bit in terms of a region itself that is in the midst of flux. I've likened it to a hinge moment in the Middle East. We are witnessing an emerging new order in the Middle East. And I think as a result, we are seeing that the Gulf, Saudi Arabia in particular, really are the new center of gravity in the region, less so the traditional centers of gravity of Egypt, certainly in the past. Remember, President Obama, of course, traveled to Egypt, among the other countries in the Middle East, and Israel as one of his first forays.
He didn't go to Israel,
he did not go. That's right.
But Melania went to Egypt.
There we are. Okay, Melania went to Egypt. But my point being that I think we should understand this trip also as a shifting dynamic of the region itself, and we should understand that, and we can unpack that further. The dramatic announcement about the lifting of Syria sanctions, and by the way, we have to see how that actually comes into fruition, because many of the sanctions were passed by law by Congress, and so they can only be repealed by Congress. But of course, the president can suspend sanctions if he wants, and it's a momentous announcement, and I think it was done actually as part of this transactional mood that the president is in, because this is something that the Saudis in particular have been pushing for, as have the Turks. The president referenced them directly in announcing that he was lifting the sanctions. The sanctions come, and we can talk a bit more about Syria perhaps in a little bit, at a time of enormous change in Syria with the collapse of the Assad regime last December. And many have been advocating that sanctions do need to be lifted so that the government can stabilize an economy that is essentially collapsed, a country that could actually fall back into turmoil because of economic reasons. The last point I'll say on this, and so the president, in a sense, was responding to an ask by the Saudis, the Turks, and others. This also touches on the element of burden sharing, Dave, that you talked about, because in lifting the sanctions, this allows for these Gulf countries in a more unfettered way to provide assistance, to provide support for Syria's reconstruction. We've already seen the Qataris and the Saudis pay off Syria's World Bank debt. We've been given to understand that the Qataris would want to help pay salaries of Syrian government employees, but were fearful of doing so because of the sanctions. And so this paves the way for these Gulf countries to actually take on the burden of helping to stabilize and ultimately rebuild Syria, something that the United States certainly is not going to do, nor I think could we expect many of the Western countries to do.
It's fascinating, and I want to get back to Syria and sort of that part of the region. But David, Mona's first point, the transformation, this hinge point, the change that we're seeing in the Middle East. Do you see it the same way? And how's the hinge coming? Where is the power moving towards, and what does that mean for stability within a region that for the past 25, 30 years has really been a center of instability for so long and drawn us in as a result, although we may have been part of the instability at times ourselves.
Well, you know, if you go back to the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, they talked about the sick man on the Bosphorus. I think we can talk today about the sick man on the Nile. Egypt's economy is awful. It's a statist economy. The government controls 30 to 40% of all industry. They're squeezing out the private sector. They're buying submarines, marine amphibious landing vehicles, building new cities, making bad choices. And Egypt just doesn't have the diplomatic heft facing this sort of economic crisis that it had decades ago. And the vacuum has really been filled not only by Turkey, which years ago many had hoped would become a European country, but is really deeply involved even more so in the Middle East, and by Saudi Arabia, and to some extent UAE. Qatar plays at the margins. They have certain projects that are oftentimes affiliated or critiqued heavily in the United States as being oriented toward supporting bad actors, Muslim Brotherhood, etc. But the major actors are Saudi Arabia and UAE among the Arab states. Diplomatically, having the wherewithal to support initiatives economically. Qatar too, when the United States just a few weeks ago, and we'll get to Lebanon eventually, but the United States doesn't have an authority to pay the salaries of the Lebanese armed forces. We did it once under the Biden administration that was heavily criticized, and there was a strange mechanism to do so. This time, the United States saw it in his interest to get this force paid because they're doing the work vis-a-vis Hezbollah. And so the Qataris stepped in and filled the gap. These countries are important. And these countries, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, along with Israel and Turkey, are the actors that are determining the future of the region.
Aaron, David mentioned, finally, 15 minutes into a conversation, Israel, which is late in the Middle East. But what's Israel thinking of this trip? The president is going. Once again, as I mentioned, Obama didn't go. He was deeply criticized. But if there was one person Benjamin Netanyahu was putting his hope on to see as president of the United States, it's Donald Trump. It doesn't look like that's still the case today. What's happening in the relationship between the United States and Israel, and what impact is that going to have on the dynamics in the region?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. We're 4 months in. If you look at Donald Trump's record on Israel over the last 4 months, you would probably have to conclude that if Biden's was passive aggressive, that is to say, tremendous anger and frustration, but not a single action that any right-thinking person would conclude was sustained or serious pressure on Israel. Frustration. In the last 4 months, Donald Trump's actions toward Israel have been nothing short of Trump 1.0 on steroids. He released the shipment of 2,000 bombs. He released the 24,000 rifles the Biden administration suspended because they feared it would go to Israeli settlers. He removed the sanctions on Israeli settlers. He all but acquiesced. And even now, although there's an asterisk here, on allowing Israel to control the tactics and strategy of Gaza, he has not pressed Israel on, as the Biden administration did, on facilitating humanitarian assistance. He validated the fantasies of the Israeli right wing by proclaiming that he was going to turn Gaza into the Riviera, and that I think explicitly even intimated that Palestinians there should leave. He has essentially fulfilled the dreams and aspirations, not just of Benjamin Netanyahu, but of the most right-wing government in Israel's history. And now the asterisk. Donald Trump, Joe Biden's inability to pressure Israel was a function of, and I use this word very carefully, but I mean it, his love for the idea, the security, and the people of Israel. Biden's entire career was interspersed with Israel. As a creature of the Senate, as self-described Christian Zionist, this is not Donald Trump. Back to David's point on transaction. Donald Trump may self-style himself the most pro-Israeli president in human history, but the reality is, and the February 28th encounter in the Oval between Vance, Trump, and Zelensky, every American ally should draw a possible conclusion from that. And that is this, that if an ally gets between something Donald Trump and something he wants, there may be trouble. So I'd only close by saying, and I'm not prepared to say that Donald Trump is prepared to do what Biden did not, but the signs are quite extraordinary. No administration I ever worked for, Republican or Democrat, would ever countenance their special hostage negotiator, Adam Bowler, to had 3 meetings with a group that is an FTO, foreign terrorist organization, that willfully murdered an American in August of last year. No Republican or Democratic administration I ever worked for would cut a deal to free Don Alexander, in which the Israelis had to learn from their own intelligence, not from the Trump administration. And no administration would cut a deal with the Houthis, which essentially implicitly had Donald Trump saying it's okay. I don't really care if you launch ballistic missiles and drones at Israel, as long as you leave our naval assets and U.S. flagged their own commercial vessels in the Red Sea. Okay, no administration has acted that way. And then not even to mention Iran. So the real question in my judgment is this. Negotiations are on again between Israel and Hamas. At some point, they will reach the conclusion that Netanyahu's endgame in Gaza is not aligned with Hamas's. And at that point, will Donald Trump exercise the extraordinary leverage he has over an Israeli prime minister, largely because there's no court of appeals for Benjamin Netanyahu. Under Obama and Biden, he could look to the Republican Party for support. Donald Trump owns the Republican Party. And what Trump probably wills it on Israel will go and will be accepted. So that's my test. Will Donald Trump actually do anything that could be described as serious and sustained pressure? So far, the answer is no. But the data points I'm collecting on things that he's doing that no other administration has ever done are, they're gathering, put it that way.
A fascinating sort of lineup here of on the one hand, meeting as many of the desires on the Israeli government as they possibly want, and other are doing pretty astonishing things for anyone who's looked at U.S.-Israeli relations for a long time. So I think Aaron is got it right from that perspective. I want to talk about Gaza. I also want to talk about sort of Israel in the region, because Israel has emerged post October 7, 2023 as a different actor in the region, and has achieved some very significant military and, I would argue, strategic victories as a result of its behavior. Mona, where do you see Israel being? Where is it today, and where do you see it moving towards? Leaving aside for a moment whether this new hinge point that Aaron talked about, American pressure will come. What do the Israelis want, and how are they going to get it?
Well, I think Aaron put it correctly when he said that Israel has achieved escalation dominance in the region. I think the challenge before Israel is whether it can translate those sort of tactical military gains on the ground into strategic wins. And I'm not sure that they have. I think If you look at what has happened, in particular since mid-September of last year with the pager attack, it was like out of a James Bond movie. The ways in which Israel over years had this plot of booby trapping, pagers and walkie-talkies that were on the persons of, all kinds, thousands of Hezbollah fighters. Of course, there were also, that blew up simultaneously. There were, of course, also a large number of civilians who were also killed in the attacks. But that, to me, was a threshold moment as well for the region. That was, I think, an unparalleled tactic by Israel that set off then what we saw, which was this pretty significant military campaign that led to essentially the decimation of Hezbollah. We also saw from that, I think the weakening, dramatic weakening of Hezbollah was a key factor in how it was that Ahmed al-Shara was able to, in a lightning offensive, accomplish in 12 days what had not been accomplished in nearly 14 years of civil war, namely the overthrow of the Assad regime. And then we saw the tit for tat that has also taken place in the region directly between Israel and Iran, another Rubicon that was crossed. And it's been an incredible 18 months in the region, lead to Israel essentially, by all accounts, wiping out or dramatically weakening Iran's air defenses and putting Iran very much on the back foot. So these are very, very significant military wins. But I fear that Israel runs the risk of overreach and of not being able to translate what it has accomplished on the ground into a lasting, sustainable strategy that will lead to its long-term security. So it continues to occupy parts of Lebanon through 5 different border posts. It is encroaching increasingly on Syrian territory and acting fairly aggressively in Syria as well. My fear is that that is not a recipe for long-term stability for Israel. And I think that this is where I hope there is a place for the United States to play a role, to help guide the region, Israel and the others, into a much more sustained and, frankly, more peaceful path.
David, comment on sort of this, on the one hand, military success and the question of strategic utility of that success. In some ways, Israel now occupies a larger footprint geographically than it has ever done, except maybe when it also occupied Sinai. But they're well into the Golan and beyond in Syria. They're in southern Lebanon. They're occupying most of Gaza. They are transforming the West Bank quite dramatically. And you do have a sense that the Israeli government's view is security comes by dominating not only your own territory, but your neighbors. And ultimately that's how they're going to achieve their victory. A very different view of security than Israeli governments have done in the past, which is through negotiations with neighbors. How do you think this is playing out in the region? Do you see this as an effective strategy? And what's the domestic underpinnings of that strategy as well, which is pretty important for what is still a democracy?
Yeah, fascinating. So long ago, an Israeli official told me, he's now a senior Israeli official, he said, Israel is a strategy-free zone. They do great on the tactical, but they don't have a long-term vision of where they want to go. And of course, the old saying applies, if you don't know where you want to go, any road will take you there. And they're having that, I think, that problem. And part of what David was referring to, Aaron was referring to, the frustration of the Trump administration is that the Israelis don't have a vision for Gaza, for the day after, for what they want to accomplish at this point as they renew the next leg of the campaign. And this goes, across the board. I think they're overstretched. They've got 180,000 men and women in the IDF. right? Now they have ongoing operations in Gaza, on the border with Gaza. They've got troops in Syria, more troops along the border. Troops in Lebanon, more troops along the border with Lebanon. They've got a deployment in Syria, and they're proactive. October 7th changed everything for Israel, how they view their defense. And I'm not old enough to remember specifically, but I'm pretty sure it was like this after 1973, after the failure of 1973, that they thought they had to be proactive, but they did go to negotiations. They saw this as a strategy, and it worked quite well. But meanwhile, they've got these troops. They're occupying swaths of Syrian territory. They're talking about defending certain ethnic religious groups like the Druze. Complained about massacres of Alawites, bombing territories outside of Damascus, and telling the new government of Syria that they cannot deploy troops south of Damascus. This, to me, really in Syria, it appears that they are hoping through their actions to keep Syria divided and weak. And that, to me, is not a winning strategy. We can talk about whether al-Shara is still Jolani, whether a jihadist is always a jihadist, right? I think we have to mistrust and verify, right? There's certain things that the government of Syria has to do, but wouldn't we want, I think in general, shouldn't Israel want a unified Syria, not a Syria that is divided into spheres of influence between Syria and Turkey, which is not a friend of Israel, it's a frenemy or a hostile entity. You don't want to be on the border with actually a real army that has real capabilities. I think the chances for clashes, are expand dramatically in that situation. I don't think they've entirely thought this through, and it's not a good look for them, frankly. And I don't know if they can sustain it, particularly in getting to the domestic issue here. In Gaza, 70% of Israelis want to end the war, get the hostages back. Netanyahu has something like 48% popularity, or percent of the vote. In Syria, whether they can sustain this in the long term. And there's the question being asked, of course, whether Netanyahu is doing this because he believes it's the right policy in Gaza, or whether it's a matter of coalition politics and to stay in power and avoid prosecution. And that, once again, is not a good look for a democratic government.
Aaron, you spent most of your life trying to figure out how to ensure Israel's security through a peaceful settlement with its neighbors. You were more engaged in the 1970s after the 1973 war. How do you read what's going on in Israel today and the strategy or the absence thereof? I think, as David rightly put it. And how is this sustainable domestically in the political system that seems to be deeply divided, not only on a whole series of domestic issues, but increasingly on a whole series of foreign policy issues?
Yeah. The late Henry Kissinger quipped that Israel had no foreign policy, only domestic politics. And I think David's being charitable in his description of the prime minister. Benjamin Netanyahu is the longest governing prime minister in the history of the state of Israel. When we dealt with him during the mid-90s, he was a man that was incredibly risk-averse. One step forward, he said he never signed an agreement with Arafat. He did. He said at Wye River he'd never shake hands with Arafat. He did. One step forward, one step back. Benjamin Netanyahu has changed. He now is risk-ready in a way that goes beyond anything that he, throughout his entire career. What is the source of that risk readiness is unclear to me, but clearly on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust in the Jerusalem District Court before 3 judges, 5 years now in running, it strikes me that his prime directive, the organizing principle of Benjamin Netanyahu's world, is to stay in power. If he doesn't stay in power, it's a reasonable chance. Ehud Olmert was indicted out of office and served 14 months in prison, that he will either be convicted or have to accept a plea deal that will drive him out of politics. Almost every decision that he has taken or avoided taking has a lot to do with maintaining the most right-wing government in the history of the state of Israel. I played this thought experiment with myself over and over since October 7. If you parachuted Ehud Barak, Yitzhak Rabin, David Ben-Gurion into October 7, would there have been any difference in the Israeli response? Any difference in the willful, indiscriminate murder, sexual predation, mutilation, the taking of hostages, the murdering of hostages? Would there have been any difference? And my conclusion is probably not. The IDF, Shin Bet, Mossad, out of guilt, shame, and a desire for revenge. There's no question about that. But the prime minister, these prime ministers would have concluded, to Mona's point, sometime along the way, that military power was not a means to an end, and it was not a means to perpetuate their own political survival. It was a tool to be used to accomplish what Mona had suggested, the conversion of escalation dominance into accommodation, transactional arrangements, even peace treaties. That has not happened, and it's unlikely to happen under Netanyahu's rule. And now he is caught between an Israeli right wing who threatens to bolt the coalition if he ends the war in Gaza, and an American president who has acquired enormous currency in the bank because of his pro-Israeli gestures, and could easily, since he controls the Republican Party, the margin for Donald Trump to pressure Israel is probably larger now than any American president since Dwight Eisenhower, who was the last American president, I might add, having worked for Bush and Baker. Denying Israel housing loan guarantees it's a discretionary program. The Israelis could have lived without it. Ben-Gurion threatened to sanction, Eisenhower threatened to sanction Ben-Gurion politically and economically if he did not withdraw Israeli forces from Sinai, and Ben-Gurion complied. That was the first and last time any American president has ever taken such a step. I don't know whether Donald Trump will take it, but I think Netanyahu is more in a box. And I could not help but think, watching what was happening in Saudi Arabia with the Hamas dialogue, with Iranian negotiations, with the Chinese brokered Saudi-Iranian detente. It just seemed to me for the first time that the person who wasn't invited to the party was Benjamin Netanyahu. Everything was happening in the Gulf. And there was Israel. And Trump didn't go because there was nothing to do there. He didn't have to go. He wasn't going to get hammered like Obama got hammered in 2009 for not going. The Democrats are divided. The Republicans are Israel right or wrong. Again, enormous leverage this man has, Donald Trump. We'll see if there's an occasion that he'll actually use it.
Enormous leverage, I think, is probably even an understatement in some ways. I do wonder, Mona, the change in Israeli policy that doesn't seem to have come forward in our public discussion as much. We haven't talked about it yet here with regard to Gaza. Mm-hmm. Where there is basically now, it seems to me, to be a decision that Gaza needs to be occupied. All of it, or at least, or most of it, by Israel. That will start, I believe, on the 15th, as soon as the president is supposed to leave the region. That is the deadline that Israel has set. There may be a deal between Israel and Hamas and the hostages. That would be a wonderful thing if it were to happen, but I don't put a lot of money onto that. That plus this new way of distributing aid, 5 aid centers to provide aid for 2 million people. That's 400,000 people being fed per aid center. Just think about it. Small cities are going to be supposed to be fed there. How is this going to work out?
Not well. I mean, I think it's a very concerning moment where as I think both my colleagues have alluded, I mean, Israel really has not thought through what this day after strategy, what this long-term strategy for Gaza looks like. And it does indeed look to be moving toward a policy of occupation, of cantonizing, occupying, restricting humanitarian assistance. This plan that's been presented has been disparaged by humanitarian organizations as not adhering to the principles of how assistance is to be given, with dignity, impartiality, neutrality, etc. There's concerns, again, alarms being raised about the potential of famine again in Gaza. So it's incredibly bleak. And I guess, for me, the concern that I would raise with all of this, Ivo, is that, is Israel planting the seeds with this particular approach, should it adhere to it, for its own forever war, its own sort of long-term insurgency, in its backyard? Because it's hard to understand with these kinds of steps being implemented, these policies in place, how Israel extricates itself from Gaza in a way that begins to move, towards some semblance of stability.
It's so much easier to occupy than to deoccupy, as we always find, or to start wars than end wars.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Iran as a final issue, and then open it up for questions. And David, I think we've learned something interesting that I think knew from the President Trump, but it's been reaffirmed. This is not a man who likes to use force. He did say, yes, let's do this, these Houthi strikes, but as the New York Times reported today, 30 days in, not much was accomplished, and he just said, let's just declare victory and end this war. It does suggest to me that he's going to give the talks with Iran a good run to see if he can get to a deal, even if that means that the deal, in order to get to a deal, may have to shave some corners about what it is that we are supposed to achieve, but get a deal. So these talks have now been going on. First direct talks between the United States and Iran since 2015. Some of them are direct, some of them are indirect, but there's clearly close talks. It seems to be that the issue is enrichment or no enrichment as the key issue, as it was before 2015, with the Iranians saying, no, we have a civilian nuclear program, we need to be able to have our own fuel, and the Americans saying, no, you cannot have enrichment. I think we're selling an enrichment or a reprocessing facility to the Saudis as we're speaking, but that's a different issue. How do you see this negotiation playing out, and how much do you think the Iranians need this deal, and how much do you think Trump needs this deal or wants this deal?
So first, underlying this whole approach is, as you correctly point out, the aversion to the use of force. I was in Trump 1. We killed Soleimani. This was a great moment. It was the right thing to do. There was so much talk about how there would be a regional war, et cetera. It never transpired. But in all the other cases before that, you remember the scuttling of ships in Fujairah, the downing of a $250 million drone in international airspace over the Persian, or is it the Arabian Gulf? The destruction of Abqaiq, a Saudi Aramco facility that took down 50% of Iran's oil production capability. After all of these, the president refrained. And I guess the argument at the time were no Americans were killed, even after they retaliated, the Iranians, for Soleimani. 100 traumatic brain injuries, got very lucky that no Americans were killed. The Iranians intended to kill Americans, both in Ain al-Assad and Erbil. President is really reticent to use force, and especially with Iran. And we see that's how he's approached the deal. We saw the tweets or the X's before the talks started, and like Ukraine, Witkoff previewed the concessions. right? He said, well, if we can't get dismantlement, then maybe we'll do limited enrichment. And so they previewed this going into the talks. And this is not surprisingly where we're at today. And one of the reasons that Aaron hinted at why the Israelis are so concerned. This is yet another major concession that doesn't take into account, per the Israelis, but I think a fair point, Iran's lowest point ever. After losing Hezbollah, the degradation of Hezbollah, after losing Hamas, after some degradation to some extent of the Houthis, after losing the Bashar al-Assad regime, a 50, 60-year strategic ally of Iran, and with their proxy, the Hashid, the Iranian-backed militia in Iraq, sort of keeping their heads low. And with Iran's economy in a terrible spot and periodic, sporadic public protests, this is the time that you're going to get the best deal ever. The deal that is in our favor, the deal that pushes them. And before we brought them home with B-2 bombers, two aircraft carriers, submarines in the region, a combination of pressure and Iran at a weak point. And it looks like we're going to take the knee because we want the agreement more than the Iranians do. And they know it. So this is, I think, a remarkable turn of events, right? In places like Lebanon, and we can talk about that during Q&A, we, the Israelis, have looked to consolidate the military victory or the diminishment and degradation of Hezbollah. In Iran, with all of these regional, conditions, we don't appear to be pressing them as hard as we should. When we hear that this negotiation is going well, I just got back from a week in Oman, right? And everyone is so pleased that the environment of the negotiations is so pleasant and things are going so well. That's a bad sign.
That sounds like Aaron. That sounds like Bibi Netanyahu. This is a bad sign, bad deal. In many ways, I had a lunch yesterday with someone you and I know well, who was in the last days of the Biden administration, and they were worried that the Israelis might strike during those last days but then their hope was that they would hope that Trump would do it for them, that they would be able to do it together with him, that's why in the end they didn't do it. And they're miscalculating. I mean, they miscalculated massively, I think, in the way that David rightly underscores. Trump's not interested in striking the Iranians. And that became pretty clear in that other wonderful Oval Office meeting with Bibi Netanyahu and the president. When was it? In April, I believe, early April, in which he said we're going to start negotiations, and then forgot to tell Netanyahu that was what we're going to do. How is Netanyahu going to deal with this?
I mean, I think the idea that the Israelis would strike unilaterally without American acquiescence or sanction is now, unless the Iranians overplay their hand and you ended up with some sort of pretext, which the Iranians are not going to provide. I mean, I think David's right. I hope he's not right. I wonder. I mean, when does Iran make a decision? My colleague at Carnegie, Karim Sedjapour, says when the international community is aligned, as they were in the JCPOA, when Iran got something, when it wasn't a transformation that required some fundamental change internally in the regime, and when there was fear that if there were no agreement, there would be a strike. Some of those elements were responsible for the JCPOA. I don't know whether Trump, in all his unpredictability, is making a compelling case for the alternative. He said it again in Saudi, didn't he? I think he offered a way out for the Iranians, but I think he also said that if you don't choose this way, bad things can happen. I don't know. I just don't know whether the Iranians believe it or not, and how Trump would make them believe it. I thought for a while that the administration would strike an Iranian asset in the Gulf. If in fact the Houthis continued their attacks in the Red Sea, but that hasn't happened. I don't know how else, without using the Israelis, you would get Iran's attention. So I think we're at a moment where Steve Witkoff, the envoy for everything, and I have to say, 4 rounds of negotiation, I haven't a clue of what is going on. Witkoff is reported to say that he doesn't like to exchange paper. It reminds me of the Hollywood mogul, what's his name? Not Cecil B. DeMille, Samuel Goldwyn Mayer, who said an oral agreement isn't worth the paper it's written on. There has to be a text here. I mean, all negotiations that succeed have texts. There are papers that are exchanged. There's details. You can't be done on the back of a cocktail napkin. If what they're trying to do is construct a declaration of principles that would buy 6, 8, 10 months and allow them to negotiate that, I mean, maybe, but I can't figure it out.
Well, with that, we're going to open up for questions because if we can't figure it out, maybe the audience can. So let's start over here. If you want a question, there's a microphone in the middle of the room. So I would urge you to join the gentleman here. Please state your name, and this is not the time for lectures. It has to be a question.
Eric Mao from the Geopolitical Forum, and my question is: we spent a lot of time. The panel spent a lot of time today on Israel, U.S., Trump, Netanyahu, for obvious reason, and they're big players in this transitional time. But if we look at a longer view, we take a longer view. Do each distinguished panelist today have a view, can see a path to peace in Middle East at all? Thank you.
It depends on, so peace between Israel and Palestine, peace with the absence of war.
Please, peace in absence of war, because we have Iran and different factions, Houthis, Israel, as well as Palestine.
Mona, when is this? Why can't there be peace?
Well, as a former staff of the U.S. Institute of Peace, I think, look, I actually could sketch for you an optimistic scenario based even on where we are right now, where there is a confluence of factors and dynamics that does lead to significant de-escalation in the region and movement toward broader stabilization. We've just finished talking about Iran. And I concur with David and Aaron in terms of, I think the Iranians are supreme negotiators, and they may well run circles around Mr. Witkoff. They may end up with a deal that favors them, but it's clear that the balance in the region is toward de-escalation and toward finding a way forward. So let's imagine that there is some deal or some movement towards stabilization with Iran that's negotiated. We have Syria. We have the removal of the fall of one of the most brutal dictators that the region has seen, and the potential for Syria to be stabilized. We have Gulf countries willing to pour in resources. We have Turkey and Israel. We have to see if they can come to some sort of understanding about letting Syria be a stable, peaceful Syria. We have Lebanon, which we haven't really talked about, which really is actually in one of the most optimistic or sort of most positive positions it's been in quite some time. There was even at one point talk, could there even be final status land border negotiated between Israel and Lebanon? So I think the pieces are there. Let's put Gaza aside, okay? For movement that puts the region on a much more stable and peaceful trajectory.
In fact, one of the issues we haven't mentioned at all yet is the PKK declaration to end
That's right. There's another one. Right?
Its military campaign against Turkey, an important step. So there may well be steps. There was a gentleman he's standing in the back, but come forward and ask your question next. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Nisim Nesher. Do you think that it's naive from the government, the administration, to reach out to Syria and remove the sanctions when the leader is Al-Qaeda, jihadist, with a Western suit, but still massacre the people, the Alawis, the Druze, and the same token, naive upon reaching to Iran when we know they are masters in manipulating and not really keeping agreements. And that's the question. But the comment, as an Israeli that served the war in 73, you cannot compare October 7th with the 73 war. Then there was a government that took responsibility. Now the government, a year and a half later, still don't take responsibility. Thank you.
Comment noted and well said. We kind of have addressed your question, but I mean, David addressed it and somewhat, but let's go around the room and talk about whether the leadership in Syria is someone we can do, quote, business with, or once a jihadist, always a jihadist. Mona, you want to start?
I don't think we can answer it definitively.
So what do we do?
Right. So that's where a calibrated relief of sanctions would probably have made more sense than the wholesale lifting of all the sanctions. But look, I think he has definitely shown pragmatic elements, Ahmed al-Shara. And as I said, I think what's almost more dangerous in a way for Syria is for it to be left in this state of economic collapse, which itself could lead to instability and frankly, even the breakup of the country. So I think movement towards some sanctions relief does make sense. Ahmed al-Shara, I think it's going to take a lot of diplomacy, a lot of testing in order to see whether he is true to his word and what kind of Syria he would lead.
David?
Yeah, I mean, we can't go into this thinking that Syria is going to be a Jeffersonian democracy. Other than Israel, like, what are the democracies in the region? And Israel is an imperfect democracy at that. Al-Shara has said all the right things publicly about women, about tolerance, etc. It would be unfortunate if you couldn't get a drink in Damascus anymore, but you could never get a drink in Kuwait, right? And they're a great partner for the United States. As for the Alawites and the Druze, frankly, there is so much disinformation out there. I don't deny that this happened. In the case of the Alawites, there's reports of Iranian meddling. There's reports of former regime elements attacking the regime. In the case of the Druze, reports of provocation. This is going to take a long time to hammer out. Let's not forget, in any event, that the Alawites, right, were the backbone of the regime that killed 500,000 Syrians and ruled with their boot on the throat of the Syrian people for 60 years. This is a broken society. It's going to take a long time to heal. But the administration did have actually a pretty reasonable policy before the announcement of the relief of all the sanctions, which was they gave a list of 8 points to the al-Shara regime or government and said, hey, you're going to have to satisfy us on these before we talk about lifting sanctions. And there were some things that they did, like have a constitutional committee. It was a little weak, but they had it. They invited in chemical weapons inspectors to look at their chemical weapons, previous chemical weapon sites. But the most important ones they haven't touched yet, which really relate to foreign fighters, jihadis, people who are designated terrorists, serving in key positions in the military, right? This gives me cause for pause, but we're going to have temporary sanctions relief here. And if Congress is actually ever going to release that or lift them, they're going to have to do quite a bit more. I worry, though, like Mona, that if we don't ever lift the sanctions, that this will be a self-fulfilling prophecy, that Syria will be troubled, decimated economically, 2 hours of electricity in the capital, and they're never going to pull it together.
We're out of time, but I want to go around all three of you, and starting Aaron with you. What's the one thing you're going to be looking for in the next 2-3 months of where the region may be going in a positive or a negative way.
I can't figure out.
What should we be looking at?
I can't figure out what I'm going to do next Tuesday, let alone 2 or 3 months. Let me just make a broad comment that hopefully can tie some of this together. There's one missing ingredient in this region. There are a lot of missing ingredients, but there's one sine qua non. If you want transactional change, what Mona referred to, more stability, some accommodation, then you could probably have that. If you want a region that actually is transformed over time, then you need something you don't have. And that is leaders who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies. Leaders who are not extractive, even the ones who pretend to be democratic. Leaders who are risk ready and understand politics and have legitimacy. I do not see them. In the form of MBS, you get a repressor. That's not the kind of leadership I'm talking about. And it seems to me that that is the key. It's missing. I don't have a clue how to help revitalize it. It's an internal process largely. But that to me is what is not here, particularly when it comes to Israel, Palestine. And in the wake of October 7, October 7 demonstrated something with a terrifying clarity, that the only solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is separation through negotiation. But it also demonstrated something else, that getting there in the wake of the bloodletting and the trauma is harder than it's ever been. Leadership.
Leadership. David also mentioned the absence of U.S. leadership, which was there too. If only all problems could be solved by having better leaders, then we wouldn't be doing what we do here, which is to figure out how to solve these problems. I agree. The problem is we never have the right leaders, and that makes life so hard. What I do know, however, is I can't think of 3 people tonight to have given more clarity in just over an hour on what's happening in the Middle East in a broad sense than Aaron David Miller, Mona Yacobian, and David Shanker. Thank you so much for your comments. Thank you all.
Thank you, though. Mona, it was great seeing you, David, as well.